Hey everybody, this is an afterword to the English edition, the English language edition uh, of Guy Debord by Anselm Jappe. I just finished reading this book, and I'm like the actual bulk of the text of the book. I'm just reading the afterword now. I think it was a really tremendous read, and it made me super excited about theory. So I highly recommend it, but let's go. Quote, if you cannot rid yourself of a bandit, end quote, goes an Italian proverb, quote, make him into a baron, end quote. Almost until his death, Guy Debord was the object of a conspiracy of silence. These days, Debord's work, and the work of the Situationists in general, seem rather to have fallen prey to a conspiracy of chatter that is liable to distort their meaning beyond all recognition. In France, the strong tendency now is to treat Debord as an elegant stylist, the actual content of whose writing is of scant interest. In Great Britain and the United States, by contrast, where in the last decade more has been published on the Situationists than anywhere else, even France, and where the subject was taken up by academic and mainstream commentators sooner than in other countries, the Situationist movement is viewed almost exclusively from the angle of the history of culture. Practically all current discussion of the Situationists embody an attempt, perhaps not always conscious, to render them innocuous, to normalize the Situationists by one means or another. One such means is flatly to present this anti-political and anti-artistic movement as political and artistic, and then concentrate entirely on the Situationist International's aesthetic and, quote, ludic, end quote, concerns. Hence the almost complete silence surrounding everything the Situationist International did after breaking with the Situationist International's remaining artist members in 1962. What might be called the official account thus attends with relentless philological rigor to every last pronouncement on such early letterist and Situationist themes as the, quote, as the dérive, or, quote, unitary urbanism, end quote, only to shy away and take cover behind vague generalities when it comes to characterizing the Situationist critique of society or explaining its pertinence, to which full lip service is nevertheless paid. The truth is that the unquestionably admirable forms of the Situationist International's assault on the established world during the organization's, quote, artistic phase, end quote, cannot be fully appreciated if one does not see that this was indeed but a first stage which, had it not been very quickly surpassed by an activity of much wider scope, would have been confined to a purely ornamental role within the prevailing spectacle. Another consequence of focusing exclusively on the first third of the Situationist International's history is that Debord's role is downplayed even if he survives as an obsessing and shadowy presence. We should do well to remember the degree to which the Situationist International was truly Debord's creation. It is true that especially in the early days others contributed a great deal, yet even those contributions would never have had the same significance were it not for the unmistakable style, the incomparable language, and the particular tone for which the Situationist International was renowned, and all of these it owed to Debord alone. With the exception of Asger Jorn, all the other Situationists would probably be forgotten today were it not for the association of their names with the Situationist International and hence with Debord. As for the, quote, Nashists, end quote, and other artists expelled from the Situationist International, their later activities are often placed under the rubric of, quote, Situationism, end quote. For some commentators, indeed, some special virtue seems to attach to having been one of these, quote, victims of Debord, end quote. There are people, too, who seem to feel that the ideal heir to the subversive work of the Situationists is something called, quote, transgressive constructionism, end quote. At times, the tendency variously known as post-structuralism, deconstructionism, postmodernism, or media theory gets an urge to be critical, and in that mood strives to incorporate Guy Debord. One might do worse in response than reiterate in a slightly updated form a sentiment first expressed in the Situationist Journal in 1967, quote, we want ideas to become dangerous once again. We cannot allow people to support us on the basis of a wishy-washy fake eclecticism along with the Derridas, Lyotars, the Rortys, and the Baudrillards, end quote. In any case, the present work defends quite another view, namely that Debord's theory is in essence a continuation of the work of Hegel and Marx. That Debord's theory is in essence a continuation of the work of Marx and Hegel, and that its importance inheres, for the most part, precisely in this fact. Those who have no interest in the Hegelian dialectic and in Marx's interpretation of the Hegelian dialectic, or in the authors chiefly responsible for keeping this line of inquiry alive, run the risk of, or rather will succeed in, understanding very little of the society of the spectacle. Footnote. Whereas this book pays ample attention to Lukács's influence on Debord and to the parallel between Debord and Adorno, I suspect I have delved too little into Debord's debt to Karl Korsch. End footnote. Debord's work itself effectively demonstrates, though none of the academic or subcultural accounts acknowledge this, that Hegelian Marxist concepts are still the most useful for understanding the modern world, particularly the self-destructive character of society driven by the commodity. Footnote. For interpretation of Marx close to that which informs this book, see the excellent work of Moïse Bastone, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, published in 1993. Only now, in fact, globalization, having finally realized the notorious, quote, totality, end quote, is Hegelian Marxist theory really coming into its own, and it is no doubt for this very reason that our accredited intellectuals have for quite some time, and with rare unanimity, been declaring that nothing could be as out of date and irrelevant as the concepts of Hegel. Hegel is the greatest absentee of the day, surpassing even Marx in this regard, or even Marxism is acceptable to a degree so long as Marxism is guaranteed Hegel-free, so long as it is analytical, structuralist, or ethical in character, to name the leading variants. Hegelian Marxism is generally dismissed both within and outside of academia as the deadest of dead dogs, as the supreme instance of the kind of, quote, totalizing theory, end quote, and, quote, grand narrative, end quote, that modern society has declared itself loudly and clearly unwilling to countenance. In resorting to such exorcisms, official knowledge follows a sure instinct, for without the categories of the Hegelian dialectic, no matter how much they need to be reversed, reworked, turned upside down, or transcended, all understandings of capitalist society must remain in the best of circumstances, fragmentary and devoid of any possible application. It will be what the Situationist International called, quote, research without direction for use, end quote. Even such truth as may be found by means of non-dialectical methods will be unusable or turn into falsehoods unless they are integrated into an understanding of the totality. This concept seemingly constitutes the horror maximus of, quote, politically correct, end quote, thinkers, but hardly more tolerable to them are the dialectical concepts of the difference between essence and phenomenon, and of an objective truth distinct from the empirical truth, or indeed any sense that every phenomenon is a result, and hence explicable only in terms of its historical genesis. This is not the place to debate whether the Hegelian interpretation, according to which every single phenomenon is but one moment in the process of becoming a totality, in the process of becoming a totality, has universal ontological validity and holds good for every historical period. What is indisputable is that such a negative totality does indeed exist in the case of capitalist society, because the all-pervading logic of commodities concedes no autonomy to any other reality, and hence that only a form of thinking based on the totality can adequately account for the situation in which we find ourselves. For postmodern thought, this conclusion is both forbidden and strictly meaningless. How exactly Debord's postmodern admirers contrive to blind themselves to the fact that his is a, quote, totalizing theory, end quote, is a secret known only to themselves. The Hegelian dialectic permeates the entire first part of Capital Volume 1, where Marx explores the basic determinants constituted by value, commodities, and money, and their profoundly contradictory and ultimately self-destructive character. This analysis of the, quote, cell form, end quote, today represents Marx's most vital legacy, and Debord's recovery of it is undoubtedly one of his main achievements. The best example of a Hegelianizing concept in Marx, a concept for this very reason almost completely ignored in the Marxist tradition, is that of abstract labor, discussed in some detail in this book. The notion that anything could be simultaneously concrete and abstract is, of course, an affront to the positivist consciousness. Yet the dynamic of abstract labor as an end in itself, driven by a need for continual growth way beyond all consideration of utility, is the only reasonable explanation for the convulsions of the present fin de siècle. I don't know how to say that. Fin de siècle? I don't know. It's turn of the century. This kind of historical thought cannot therefore remain merely contemplative. The shift to practice is intrinsic to the Hegelian Marxist dialectics, as to no other kind of thinking. Nowhere else is thought driven in this way towards its own actualization. It is unsurprising that Hegelian Marxist theories have come to the fore at times of violent social revolt, around 1920, say, or in 1968. The Surrealists and the Situationists may have not studied the science of logic in the greatest detail, but the Surrealists and Situationists knew perfectly well why Hegel had to be the point of reference. In contrast, the postmodernist galaxy, whatever its subjective intentions, carries apology for what exists to the extreme. The postmodernist galaxy's... Oh, shit. I didn't even hear that. Excuse me. That's funny. So, in contrast, the postmodernist galaxy, whatever the postmodernist galaxy's subjective intentions, carries apology for what exists to the extreme. Its index verborum prohibitorum coincides exactly with the categories of dialectical thought: totality, truth, reason, history, objectivity. All questions concerning the fetishistic forms that govern society are explicitly tabooed. But deconstructionism is canny, and it successfully mimics a radical critique of all received ideas. By means of a now familiar device, it channels the real social need for a thoroughgoing and corrosive critique, applied even to the seemingly most self-evident and neutral ties, into innocuous forms that always end up willy-nilly obeying, quote, the syntax of the spectacle, end quote, a perfect instance of détournement, but a détournement carried out in this case by power. A widespread misconception sees Debord as a, quote, precursor, end quote, of Baudrillard, and Baudrillard's notion of the, quote, simulacrum as a more radical version of the notion of the spectacle. Feuerbach's assertion that our age, quote, prefers the copy to the original, end quote, used by Debord as an epigraph for the society of the spectacle, thus turns out to hold good even for radical criticism. In response to the threat posed by the emergence of situationist theory, some apologists for the reigning order of things chose immediately after 1968 to speak the language of radical criticism, and indeed to do so in a way that seemed, if anything, a little bit more extreme and daring. The actual intent and content, however, were opposed to any radical critique. If it is true that we are immersed in a sea of uncontrollable images barring our way to reality, this may make it seem all the bolder to assert that reality has completely disappeared and that the situationists were still too timid or too optimistic because the process of abstraction has now devoured the whole of reality, and the spectacle has become even more, quote, spectacular, end quote, even more totalitarian than had at first been supposed, and has even extended its criminal proclivities to the, quote, murder of reality, end quote, itself. Footnote. The differences between Debord and Baudrillard are understood even by Sadi Plant, the most radical who wrote The Most Radical Gesture, The Situationist International in a Postmodern Age, and by Stephen Best and Douglas Kellner, The Postmodern Turn, especially Chapter 3, quote, From the Society of the Spectacle to the Realm of Simulation, Debord, Baudrillard, and Postmodernity. It's funny, I should probably reread that book. I read The Postmodern Turn when I was, first interested in ideas. And I'd like to... it's one of the first books about theory that I ever read. Just because you hear this term postmodern a lot. But anyway, although Baudrillard hardly ever cites the Situationists, Baudrillard frequently speaks of the, quote, spectacle, end quote, or of, quote, the society of the spectacle, end quote. Baudrillard adopts Debord's account of a progressive detachment of the spectacle from reality, but remains on the strictly phenomenological plane, never looking for a reason beyond the spectator's supposedly irresistible and irrational urge to embrace the spectacle. When Baudrillard asserts that, quote, the abstraction of the, quote, spectacle, end quote, was never irrevocable, even for the situationist, ... whereas unconditional realization is irrevocable, end quote. When Debord maintains that the spectacle, quote, still left room for a critical consciousness and demystification, end quote, but that we are now, quote, beyond all disalienation, end quote, it becomes quite obvious that the sole purpose of such references is to proclaim the vanity of any resistance to the spectacle. Excuse me, I fucked that up. Sorry, I'm going to reread that last paragraph because I think I messed it all up. Although Baudrillard hardly ever cites the Situationists, Baudrillard frequently speaks of the, quote, spectacle, or of, quote, the society of the spectacle, end quote. Baudrillard adopts Debord's account of a progressive detachment of the spectacle from reality, but remains on the strictly phenomenological plane, never looking for a reason beyond the spectator's supposedly irresistible and irrational urge to embrace the spectacle. When Baudrillard asserts that, quote, the abstraction of the, quote, spectacle, end quote, was never irrevocable, even for the Situationists, ... whereas unconditional realization is irrevocable, end quote. When Baudrillard maintains that the spectacle, quote, still left room for a critical deconsciousness and demystification, end quote, but that we are now, quote, beyond all disalienation, end quote, it becomes quite obvious that the sole purpose of such references is to proclaim the vanity of any resistance to the spectacle. Footnote, Jean Baudrillard, Le Crime Parfait. English translation by Chris Turner, The Perfect Crime. End footnote. Pompously presented as an uncomfortable truth, even as a terrifying discovery, the alleged disappearance of reality is in fact eminently reassured in a period of crisis. If the tautological character of the spectacle as denounced by Debord expresses the automatism and commodity economy proceeding in its freedom from any kind of control along its mad way, then there is indeed much to be afraid of. But if, on the contrary, it is a matter of signs that refer only to other signs, which in turn refer to yet others, if there is no original of the unfaithful copy, then there is absolutely no danger of getting entangled with reality. One might claim to pass a radically negative moral judgment on such a state of affairs, but any such judgment would perforce itself be strictly decorative. But the postmodern is better considered not on a theoretical level, but as the reflection of a particular historical moment. The, quote, derealization, end quote, so often evoked by postmodern thinkers had a distinctly, quote, real, end quote, basis in the purely speculative boom of the 1980s, financed by debt and fueled by a great mass of capital no longer susceptible of productive investment. The euphoric climate of the times was a big bubble of false pretenses. In a sense, the euphoric climate of the times was a big bubble of false pretenses. In a word, the boom and the euphoria were both simulated. At the same time, derealization was very much yearned for, and even more so once the euphoria evaporated along with the prospect of indefinitely prolonging the artificial life of a financial system devoid of any basis in production. When the extreme transience of the foundation of one's own life, whether in the individual or the collective sense, becomes apparent, when reality in all of reality's fearsomeness can no longer be kept at bay but is still not wholly perceptible, when your neighbor's house is burning down but your own is barely scorched, then the moment is right for theorists proclaiming that all is relative and nothing is certain, that nothing is irreparably lost because in every case there is a copy, a prosthesis, a substitute ready to hand, that everything is interchangeable, combinable, dismantleable. The portion of truth contained in postmodern theory resides in its description of processes of virtualization, in the fact that it took those processes seriously. Viewed simply as a description of the reality of the last decades, postmodernism has indeed often been superior to Marxist-inspired sociology. Postmodernism rightly condemns the positive references of, quote, traditional Marxist, end quote, to inherently capitalist categories such as labor value and production, but in the end, though it raises real questions, its answers come from nowhere and go nowhere. A few other misapprehensions need dispelling in regard to the canonical image of Debord that is now rapidly being built up. First of all, Debord was not a run-of-the-mill intellectual, and he chose his, quote, bad boy, end quote, role deliberately. His power to scandalize lay and still lies not only in what Debord said, but also in the way Debord lived and the example he set. Debord's effective demonstration that one can get heard without making any of the compromises others consider par for the course is naturally intolerable for most intellectuals today. The admirable thing about Debord, though, is not so much that Debord never compromised, which might be said, after all, of any sectarian or for that matter of a backwoods hermit, but rather that Debord succeeded in living well while still affecting the destinies of the world. Recently, a bizarre cult of Debord has arisen, threatening to transform Debord into a pop idol, a sort of Che Guevara for the more refined taste. As a Parisian bookseller put it, quote, "There's a lot of money waiting to be made out of Debord t-shirts and ashtrays," end quote. Passive worship of real-life icons as a way of compensating for the wretchedness of one's own life is a quintessentially, quote, spectacular, end quote, type of projection. As applied to Debord, it has long plagued the marginal, quote, pro-situationist, end quote, milieu, and it now seems well set to infect a much vaster hit public. Lastly, it must be stressed that despite the claims of so many of his detractors and not a few of his admirers, Debord was no nihilist. Nothing could be falser than the picture sometimes painted of a dour character mulling hateful and destructive deeds night and day, showering anyone unlucky enough to come in range with insults, denunciations, expulsions, and anathemata, and finally crowning this dismal existence with an act of suicide. The truth is that Debord loved many things, among them, of course, life in the Paris he knew in the 1950s. In later years, Debord always contrived to find people and places to savor, particularly in such quartiers populaires as still existed. Never having been taken in by the spectacle's false promise of life, Debord seems to have found some real happiness. For the ostentatious despair that flirts with self-destruction and is so much admired in art galleries and halls of learning, Debord has nothing but scorn. As early as 1955, Debord evoked the, quote, overrated corpse, end quote, of Artaud, a barb that can still outrage petty Parisian snobberies 40 years later. In his own words, quote, "I have no thought of complaining about anything, and certainly not about the way I have managed to live," end quote, Debord. Anselm, Jappe, Rome, July 1998. Thank you for listening.